But what I want to say right here is that if you are listening to this, at some point this intro episode will cut off and the rest of it will be on Patreon. Now you will get the basics. Don't get me wrong. I am going to have an intro episode for you where I go over quite a bit. But if you want to hear the rest of the intro episode, which will include a tarot reading on what I see coming for all of us and what I'm predicting, then that part of it will only be on Patreon. So for $5 a month, you can get access to that reading as well as all kinds of things that I do not talk about here on Patreon. I go a lot more in depth about my personal life and behind the scenes of Lua Nova. And there's a Lua Nova after show. There's a Lua report, etc. There's a whole episode where I talk about that. So I won't get into that right now, but that's just to kind of give you an upfront warning that when this episode cuts off and I say, hey, you want to hear the rest of this, go to patreon.com/the Lua Nova podcast. But for now, let's talk a little bit about Lua Nova. Lua Nova, the brand, came about based on my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother was a Mexican indigenous practitioner herself. And I come from a bloodline of witches. So there are witches on both sides of my family. I was only raised by the Mexican half of my family, though. That is why there is more of a Mexican influence in my culture and who I am, how I sound, etc. I am Brazilian, though, half Afro-Brazilian and half Mexican, and very proud of my roots. My mother, who is Mexican-American, she is not Afro-Latina. That is who raised me. My Afro-Brazilian father is where the Afro-Latina part of me comes from, okay? And that's just to kind of give you a little bit of background on my culture. I talk about it a lot in almost every single episode, so I don't need to place too much emphasis there. I do just want to make it very clear that this is a very pro-Latino podcast, okay? I am very proud of my roots and everything that comes with being Afro-Latina. I love, okay? Every part of it, even the ignorance, because that means I get to educate quite a few people. You will not believe the amount of people who don't even know that Brazil has the largest Black population of Latin America. It blows my mind every time I come across somebody that is stunned that somehow an Afro-Latina comes from Brazil. Well, is Brazilian. My Brazilian roots I only talk about on Patreon as far as like where I'm really from, etc. But I'm sure you could figure it out. But I did find out my real lineage, where I really come from. And I'll just put it this way. I was raised in Texas. Are you picking up what I'm putting down? Yeah. So because I live in the United States, I'm careful about what I say there. So I was raised in the United States, in Texas. I'm not a fan of Texas, and I'm not ashamed to say that. I'm not. It is very backwards in the thought process here. And there's a lot of fake Christianity and a lot of censorship, etc. And I'm just not fond of it. However, I grew up in Dallas. I grew up in the hood. If you are familiar with Dallas, then you are familiar with Oak Cliff, which is where I am from. I am from a part of Oak Cliff called Little Mexico. So I was always surrounded by my culture. I was always surrounded by my people. And it has played a very heavy influence in who I am today. And who I am today is somebody who wants marginalized groups to feel welcome here. So I hope that if you are a part of a marginalized group, LGBTQIA, did I get that right? I hope so. If I didn't, correct me. That's okay. If you are a part of different cultures that I'm not a part of, anybody who feels like you just don't fit in, I hope that you feel welcome here. I hope that I can make you feel welcome here. Now, what I am not fond of and who is not welcome here, you're the ones that are part of the disclaimer that I run, that I'm not going to run here for time purposes, but that anything from Trump supporters to Elon Musk supporters, bootlickers in general, you will never be welcome here. This is a very anti-capitalism, anti-conservative podcast, okay? Anti-religion, all of the above. None of that is welcome here. Because again, I am an Afro-Latina bloodline witch. So, I mean, I think that's common sense that those types would not be welcome here. That's not to say that there aren't conservatives who listen to me. There are people who are conservative and that I feel are welcome here, meaning that they are not judgmental. They are just conservative. There is a difference, guys. Words mean things, as Crystal from the Read would say. Okay. So that's just a little bit about my background and the name Lua Nova and where it comes from. Now, the Lua Nova podcast is a manifestation related podcast, but I don't do the whole manifesting thing the way everybody else does. There will never be $2,000 courses, $10,000 courses that you're going to get from me. Now, my tarot readings are expensive. Some would consider them expensive, some not. My tarot readings are around $100. However, that is what the Patreon is for. That's why that's only $5 or $10. Okay. This podcast, on the other hand, is always going to be free for you. Okay. That's why it exists, is that I wanted to make sure that there was something for everybody across the board. And Lua Nova, the podcast, came about because when I was looking up podcasts to listen to, I am a heavy podcast listener. I couldn't find anything relatable. There were no Afro-Latinos. There were no witches that were like me. And there was no Brazilians, no anything that were like me. Meaning that, maybe they had their own flair. Everybody is the same. And the only thing that ever seems to get pushed is one group of people, palm colored, and always people who have never struggled a day in their life, people who are trying to teach you about manifestation, but don't really get it themselves. They're pretty much just reading what they found on Pinterest and Google and ChatGPT now. And I'm just like, I don't want that. I need to create a platform that is completely different. And that is how Lua Nova came about. My great grandmother had her own business, and I learned a lot about who she was. She was a strong woman who took no shit from anybody. And I am the same. That is where the Regina George part of my opener comes from, is that I am sure that I am the villain in quite a few people's stories, and I don't care. I am never going to care about what people think of me. I don't care about who doesn't like me, because I feel that my job here on earth in this realm is to help other people who have been bullied, who have been silenced, who don't feel like they have a voice, to be that for you and to help you find yours. Because you don't know it, but you helped me find mine. The episodes that have since been archived, you can tell that I was very unsure of how I wanted to record. I censored myself a lot. And then one day I was like, I'm not helping anybody by doing that. That's not helping, because that's not even really who I am. I am not somebody who censors how I say things. I am not somebody who cares about if you need to hear the truth and it comes out in a very blunt manner. And so that is why I know that I am the villain in some people's story. And that's okay. I am very much so somebody who's going to teach you to own that side of you, to own who that is. That doesn't mean that you get a pass to be a terrible person. There's a big difference. If you've ever seen the movie Mean Girls, if you really pay attention, Regina George is not really the villain. If you really pay attention, she's not the villain like she's made out to be. Now, that doesn't mean she's perfect. She definitely had some insecurities and some issues herself, but pay attention. She's not actually the villain in that movie. Okay. And that is where that idea came from, is that sometimes you need a Regina George to speak up for you. And so this is where I come in at. And so it is. Okay. You will also hear me say, and so it is, quite often, especially when I am just giving a little verbal hex or a little verbal spell for those who might need it. And so it is. So that's a little bit of how Lua Nova came to be. The logo for Lua Nova is my mascot. That picture of the pink Mustang, the horse, that is Lua Nova the horse. Okay. That is its name. And I chose a Mustang horse because, one, of course, it is part of my name, which I'll get to in a second. But when you see a Mustang running, it looks so free. And that's what manifestation really is. That's what the law of attraction really is that's what all of the universal laws are really about, is wanting to feel free. Is that maybe in your everyday life, you don't feel that way. Maybe like myself, you overcame quite a bit of trauma and you are looking to grow. You are in the process of healing. You are healed, etc. We're always healing. We're always growing. I hope so.